What was the first book?
It was the Diamond Sutra, published in the year AD 868. Archaeologists discovered it in the caves of the Thousand Buddhas, at Kansu, Gansu, China.
Why was President Clinton impeached?
Some believe the proceedings were nothing more than a vast right-wing conspiracy. A term coined by First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, 1947, early in 1998. Still, others including enough members of the U.S. House of Representatives to bring 11 counts of impeachment against President Clinton. In December 1998 felt the nation's chief had perjured himself and obstructed justice. Many also believed he had jeopardized the authority of the U.S. presidency. Accused of having an affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, President Clinton vehemently denied it. Upon continued investigation, conducted by Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr's office, the allegations proved to be true. Since the president had been so adamant in his statements to the contrary, evidence began to accumulate that he had lied about his relationship with the young woman and that he had tried to cover up the matter. Many believed the charges against Clinton did not constitute the high crimes and misdemeanors called for by the U.S. Constitution to remove a president from office. Nevertheless, in January 1999 the U.S. Senate organized itself to hear the charges against the president. When the trial concluded in February, Clinton was acquitted of both perjury and obstruction of justice. He served out his second term and left office with high approval ratings. Despite being the subject of the longest criminal investigation of a president in history, the Clinton impeachment was the first time the federal legislature had convened itself as a court in more than 130 years since the impeachment hearings of President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, in 1868.
What happened to the Philippines after they were ceded by Spain?
After the United States gained control of the Philippines in the Treaty of Paris, 1898, the Pacific archipelago was soon embroiled in a conflict similar to the one in Cuba, which had developed into the Spanish-American War. Filipinos, determined to achieve independence, revolted in an uprising that lasted from 1899 to 1901. A civil government was established on the Philippines in 1901, and in November 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was officially established. However, the islands would continue to be the site of conflict in the coming decades, as the United States again struggled with a foreign power. This time the Japanese for control of the islands during World War II, 1939 to 45.
When was Amelia Earhart last heard from?
American aviator Amelia Earhart, 1897 to 1937, the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Was last seen on July 1, 1937, and was last heard from on July 2, as she and navigator Fred Noonan. 1893 to 1937, attempted to make an around-the-world flight along the equator. The Kansas-born Earhart first became interested in aviation, which was very new at the time, during the early 1920s, and began taking flying lessons. In 1928 she was invited to be the only woman on board a transatlantic flight, which departed from Newfoundland and landed in Wales. The trip made her famous as the first woman to cross the Atlantic Ocean by air. She followed that accomplishment in 1932 with a solo transatlantic flight. Earhart took off from Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, Canada, on the evening of May 20, 1932. Her destination was Paris. Within hours problems began for the aviator. She encountered a violent electrical storm. The altimeter failed, the wings iced up, and finally, the exhaust manifold caught on fire. Earhart decided to land in Ireland rather than attempting Paris. After a 15-hour flight, she touched down in a pasture outside of Londonderry in Northern Ireland. Again, fame and acclaim were hers, as the first woman to cross the Atlantic in a solo flight. She went on to set speed and distance records for aviation and soon conceived of the idea of flying around the world along the equator. On May 20, 1937, Earhart and Noonan took off from Oakland, California. Reaching Miami, Florida, they stopped for repairs. On June 1, 1937, they departed Miami and headed for Brazil. From there, they flew across the Atlantic to Africa and then across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. Then it was on to Karachi, Pakistan, Calcutta, India, and Burma, present-day Myanmar. Earhart reached New Guinea on June 30, and she and Noonan prepared for the most difficult leg of the journey, to Howland Island. A tiny speck of land only 2.5 miles long in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. The next day, July 1, they left New Guinea and began the 2,600-mile flight to Howland Island. On July 2, a U.S. Navy vessel picked up radio messages from Earhart that indicated reports of empty fuel tanks. Efforts to make radio contact with her failed, though an extensive search effort ensued. No trace of the plane or two-person crew was found, and no one knows for certain what happened. Speculation surrounds the disappearance. One theory was that Earhart's true mission in making the around-the-world flight was to spy on the Japanese-occupied Pacific Islands. However, this has never been substantiated, and, given the circumstances under which they were flying, the likelihood is that the plane crashed into the ocean, claiming Earhart's and Noonan's lives.
When did modern medicine begin?
The practices of modern medicine have their roots in the 1600s. It was early in the century when the work of English physician William Harvey, 1578 to 1657, demonstrated to the science community that effective medicine depends on knowledge of the body's structure. From 1597 to 1602 Harvey studied medicine at Padua, Italy, under Italian surgeon Fabricius, or Fabrici, 1537 to 1619. And went on to perform numerous experiments to learn how blood circulates through the body. In his studies, Harvey discarded the accepted method of studying parts of a problem and then filling in the gaps with theory. Instead, he aimed to understand the entire circulatory system, studying the pulse and heartbeat, and performing dissections on cadavers. He accurately concluded that the heart pumps blood through the arteries to all parts of the body and that the blood returns through the veins to the heart. Putting his discovery into writing, Harvey published an anatomical study of the motion of the heart and of the blood in animals in 1628. Another medical development during the 1600s came not at the hands of a physician or surgeon, but rather a naturalist, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, 1632 to 1723. A surveyor to the court of Holland, van Leeuwenhoek began making his own microscopes and used them to study organisms invisible to the naked eye. He had discovered microorganisms. Leeuwenhoek also observed, but did not name, bacteria. And he accurately described red blood corpuscles, striated muscle fibers, and the lens of the eye. This amateur scientist also disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. The belief that living organisms could be generated by lifeless matter.
What is Gray's anatomy?
It is the popular name for anatomy of the human body, descriptive and surgical. Written by English physician Henry Gray, 1825 or 1827 to 1861. First published in 1858, the tome is still considered the standard work on anatomy. And it is in print today in several editions, including the concise Gray's Anatomy. Gray was a lecturer in anatomy at London's St. George's Hospital and was a Fellow of Britain's Royal College of Surgeons. He was 33 years old when he compiled the book, which went on to be used by medical students for more than a century.
Why was Voltaire exiled from France?
The French writer Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, born François-Marie Arouet, Voltaire was an assumed name. Was imprisoned twice during his lifetime. He was released the second time on the condition that he leave the country. The prison terms and expulsion were the result of Voltaire's expert satire, which first got him into trouble when he was a young man. After finishing a course of study at the Jesuit school College Louis Le Grand, 1704 to 11. Voltaire joined a group of aristocrats in Paris who valued the young writer's wit. He wrote and circulated verse criticizing the regent, the Duc d'Orléans. As a result of these offensive works, Voltaire was put into the Bastille, in 1717, where he began writing an epic, the Henriade, about France's King Henry IV, 1553–1610. Full of indictments of religious fanaticism and praise for toleration. The work proved highly controversial in its day. Such anti-establishment protests eventually led the writer to have an argument with the Chevalier de Rohan, a member of one of France's most powerful families. This conflict resulted in Voltaire's arrest, imprisonment, again in the Bastille, and exile to England in 1726. He stayed in London until 1729. Returning to France, the writer penned his observations on English social and political beliefs. Letters Concerning the English Nation, 1734. Again stirring a controversy, his exaltation of English liberalism was viewed by the authorities as a criticism of French conservatism. He fled the trouble by going into seclusion in Lorraine, where he stayed through 1749. The biting criticism of his works won the writer fame as well as controversy, both of which followed him throughout his life. In 1750 he was invited to visit Prussian King Frederick the Great at court, accepting. He stayed there only 2 years. He was forced to leave in 1753 after quarreling with the man he called the philosopher king. He spent the last 20 years of his life in Switzerland, returning to Paris to see a performance of one of his plays, Irene, just before his death.
What happened at Watergate?
Watergate is a complex of upscale apartment and office buildings in Washington, D.C. In July 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic Party's national headquarters there. Among these men was James McCord Jr. 1924, the security coordinator of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, CRP. McCord was among those working to get President Richard Nixon. 1913 to 1994, a Republican, elected to a second term in office. All 5 men who were caught in the break-in were indicted on charges of burglary and wiretapping, as were CRP AG Gordon Liddy, 1930, and White House consultant E. Howard Hunt. 1918. 5 of the men pleaded guilty to the charges. McCord and Liddy were tried and found guilty. In February 1972, 5 months before the break-in at Watergate, President Nixon had traveled to China, becoming the first U.S. president to visit that country. In May he traveled to Moscow, where he signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I Treaty, the first such treaty between the United States and the USSR. When the election was held in November, Nixon won in a landslide victory over the Democratic candidate George McGovern, 1922 to 1998. But early in Nixon's second term, which began in 1973, the Watergate affair became a Full-blown political scandal when convicted burglar James McCord wrote a letter to District Court Judge John Sirica. 1904 to 1992, charging a massive cover-up in the Watergate break-in. A special Senate committee began televised investigations into the affair. Before it was all over, about 40 people, including high-level government officials, had been charged with crimes including burglary, wiretapping of citizens, violating campaign finance laws by accepting contributions in exchange for political favors, the use of government agencies to harm political opponents, and sabotage. Among those prosecuted were John Dean, 1938, former White House counsel, and Attorney General John Mitchell, 1913 to 1988. It was revealed that members of the Nixon administration had known about the Watergate burglary. It was also discovered that the president had taped conversations in the Oval Office. When Dean and Mitchell were convicted, public confidence in President Nixon plummeted. In July 1974, the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives was preparing articles of impeachment, including one that charged the president with obstruction of justice against the president. The impeachment proceedings would not make it as far as the Senate. Nixon chose to resign on August 9, 1974. He was the first and so far only U.S. president to resign from office. Shortly after taking office, Nixon's successor, Gerald R. Ford, 1913, pardoned Nixon. But Watergate remains a dark chapter in the nation's history.
How long did people believe in the theory of spontaneous generation?
Spontaneous generation, the theory that living things can develop from non-living things, originated in prehistoric times and held sway throughout the Middle Ages, 500-1350. One of the first scientists to test this theory was Italian physician Francesco Redi, 1626-1697. In 1668, Redi demonstrated that as long as meat was covered, maggots would not form on it. When left uncovered, flies would land on the meat, lay eggs, and thus, produce maggots. Despite Redi's findings, the theory of spontaneous generation continued to influence scientists and physicians for centuries. It was ultimately discredited by the successive experiments of Dutch naturalist Antony van Leeuwenhoek. 1632-1723, French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, 1822-1895. And German physician and pioneer bacteriologist Robert Koch, 1843-1910, who together proved that bacteria cause infectious diseases.
How were finished goods produced before the Industrial Revolution?
Before the factory and machine age ushered in by the Industrial Revolution, people made many of their own finished goods, bought them from small-scale producers, who manufactured the goods largely by hand. or bought them from merchants who contracted homeworkers to produce goods. The putting out system was a production method that was used in New England from the mid-1700s to the early 1800s. It worked this way: merchants supplied raw materials, cotton, for example, to families, especially women and young girls, who would make partially finished goods. Thread, or fully finished goods, cloth, for the merchant. These manufactured goods were then sold by the merchant. Homeworkers, who put out goods, provided the needed manufacturing labor of the day.
What is the strongest earthquake recorded in an urban area?
T is believed to be a November 1, 1755, earthquake that struck Lisbon, Portugal. The quake may have registered at least 9.0 on the Richter scale and lasted 6 or 7 minutes. The port city was demolished, and more than 60,000 people perished. It was felt as far away as Sweden and generated a giant wave. Tsunami, that struck the West Indies in the Caribbean Ocean. The catastrophe in Lisbon generated an intense debate among European philosophers who tried to explain why God destroyed that particular city. Then the seat of the Holy Inquisition, during High Mass on All Saints' Day.
What is the doomsday clock?
The clock represents the threat of nuclear annihilation. It was created by the Board of Directors of Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and first appeared on the cover of that magazine in 1947, 2 years after the United States had used 2 nuclear weapons against Japan. At Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to end World War II, 1939-45. The atomic scientists developed the idea in order to illustrate the threat of total destruction posed by nuclear weapons. On the clock, midnight is the time of destruction. When the clock first appeared, the scientists had set the time at 7 minutes before midnight. In the decades since, the clock had been adjusted based on the proliferation of or agreements to limit nuclear weapons. The closest it ever came to doomsday was 2 minutes until midnight. This was in 1953, shortly after the United States and the Soviet Union each tested hydrogen bombs. The farthest the minute hand has ever been from striking the hour of midnight was in 1991, when the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty (START) and announced cuts in nuclear weapons. The scientists moved the clock to read 17 minutes until midnight. In the late 1990s the clock read 14 minutes to midnight. But the 1998 testing of nuclear weapons in Pakistan and India, neighboring countries long at odds with each other, resulted in the clock being forwarded to 9 minutes before midnight. In 2002 the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists informed the world that the clock had been adjusted to 7 minutes to midnight, saying that not only had little progress been made on global nuclear disarmament, but the United States had rejected a series of arms control treaties and announced that it would withdraw from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Further, terrorists sought to acquire and use nuclear and biological weapons. All of this added up to a greater threat of nuclear annihilation.
Why do music historians talk about before Bach and after Bach?
Some scholars use these terms to classify music history since the life work of Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750, was so substantial, consisting of some 1,100 works, and has had lasting and profound influence on music composition. While he was not famous during his lifetime and had disagreements with employers throughout his career, J.S. Bach's works and innovations in many ways defined music as people now know it. The tempered scale is among his inventions, and he initiated a keyboard technique that is considered standard today. Chronologically, J.S. Bach marks the end of the prolific and variegated Baroque era, which began about 1600 and ended the year of his death, 1750. A devout Christian, J.S. Bach believed that all music was to the glory of God and the recreation of the human spirit. As a spiritual person and true believer in eternal life, he left behind an impressive body of church music, including 300 cantatas, or musical sermons, as well as passions and oratorios. As a devoted family man who believed all his children were born musicians, and therefore, the Bachs could stage drawing room music at any time. J.S. Bach also wrote chamber music, including instrumental concertos, suites, and overtures. Among his most well-known and beloved works are the St. Matthew Passion, Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, Sheep May Safely Graze, and his Christmas Oratorio.
Besides the native peoples, what discoveries did the Europeans make in the New World?
The new lands of the Western Hemisphere yielded many plants unknown in Europe. On Christopher Columbus's first voyage in 1492 he became the first European to discover maize, corn, sweet potatoes, capsicums, peppers, plantains, and pineapples. Subsequent expeditions found potatoes, wild rice, squash, tomatoes, cacao, chocolate beans, peanuts, cashews, and tobacco. These plants, many of which had been developed and cultivated by the American Indians, were carried back to Europe, and their cultivation spread to suitable climates throughout the world.
Who were the Whigs?
They were members of political parties in Scotland, England, and the United States. The name is derived from Whiggamer, meaning cattle driver, which was a derogatory term used in the 17th century to refer to Scottish Presbyterians who opposed King Charles I of England, 1600 to 1649. Charles, who ruled from 1625 to 1649, was deposed in a civil war and subsequently tried in court, convicted of treason, and beheaded. The British Whigs, who were mostly merchants and landed gentry, supported a strong parliament. They were opposed by the aristocratic Tories who upheld the power of the king. For a short period during the 18th century, the Whigs dominated political life in England. After 1832 they became part of the Liberal Party. At about the same time, the Whig Party in the United States emerged as one of the two major American political parties. The other was the Democratic Party that Americans still know today, which supported President Andrew Jackson. 1767 to 1845, for re-election in 1832. Though Jackson's first term of office had proved to be somewhat controversial, the Whigs were unable to elect their candidate, Henry Clay. 1777 to 1852, of the so-called Southern Cotton Whigs, and Jackson, called Old Hickory, went on to a second term. In the election of 1840 the Whigs, whose leadership had succeeded in uniting the party, were finally successful in putting their candidate in the White House. But William Henry Harrison, 1773 to 1841, died after only 32 days in office, and his successor, John Tyler, 1790 to 1862, alienated the Whig leaders in Congress, and they ousted him from the party. In 1848 the Whigs put Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, 1784 to 1850, in the White House, but 2 years later he, too, died in office. His successor, Millard Fillmore, 1800 to 1874, remained loyal to the Whigs, but there were problems within the party. The last Whig presidential candidate was General Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers, 1786 to 1866, in 1852, but he was defeated by Franklin Pierce, 1804 to 1869. Shortly thereafter the Whig Party broke up over the slavery issue. Most of the Northern Whigs joined the Republican Party, while most of the Southern Cotton Whigs joined the Democratic Party.
Why did Einstein write to President Roosevelt urging U.S. development of the atom bomb?
Albert Einstein, who was born in Germany in 1879 and was educated in Switzerland, where he also became a naturalized citizen, was an ardent pacifist. But, being a brilliant observer, he quickly perceived the threat posed by Nazi Germany. Einstein was visiting England in 1933 when the Nazis confiscated his property in Berlin and deprived him of his German citizenship. Some might call it lucky that the Nobel Prize-winning, 1921, scientist was out of the country. When this happened in the coming years, Other Jews certainly suffered worse fates as Nazi Germany. Under despotic ruler Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945, persecuted and killed more than 6 million Jews. Einstein moved to the United States, where he took a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. There he settled and later became an American citizen, 1940. In August 1939, just before Adolf Hitler's German troops invaded Poland and began World War II. 1939 to 45, Einstein wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, urging him to launch a government program to study nuclear energy. He further advocated the United States build an atomic bomb, cautioning that such an effort might already be underway in Germany. The United States did in fact begin development of the atomic bomb, which releases nuclear energy by splitting heavy atomic particles. The program was called the Manhattan Project, and it was centered at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, where scientists worked to obtain sufficient amounts of plutonium and uranium to make the bombs. The bombs themselves were developed in a laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The project was funded by the government to the tune of $2 billion. The first atomic device, made of plutonium, was tested in Alamogordo, New Mexico. On July 16, 1945. And less than a month later the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, August 6, and Nagasaki, August 9, Japan, forcing the Japanese to surrender. After the war, Einstein, who was always interested in world and human affairs, and had regretted the death and destruction in Japan, advocated a system of world law that he believed could prevent war in the atomic, or nuclear, age. A Zionist Jew, in 1952 he was offered the presidency of the relatively new State of Israel. Founded 1947, but he declined the honor. He died in New Jersey in 1955.
Who was the first person in space?
The first person in space was Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, 1934 to 1968, who orbited the Earth in the spaceship Vostok 1, launched April 12. 1961. The flight lasted 1 hour and 48 minutes. The achievement made Gagarin an international hero. U.S. President John F. Kennedy. 1917 to 1963, announced later that year, on November 25, that the United States would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The first step toward reaching that goal was made by putting the first American into space. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard Jr., 1923 to 1998, piloted the first U.S. space flight. Aboard the Freedom 7, the suborbital flight reached an altitude of 116.5 miles. Just more than 9 months later, the United States put a man into orbit. On February 20, 1962, Astronaut John Glenn Jr. 1921, orbited Earth 3 times in the spaceship Friendship 7.
What were the navigation acts?
Between 1645 and 1761, British Parliament passed a series of 29 laws intended to tightly control colonial trade, shipping, and industry to the benefit of English interests in America. These acts, which were largely ignored by the American colonists, were intended to ensure that the British colonies in North America remained subservient to the mother country. The initial Act of 1645 forbade the import of whale oil into England, unless it was transported aboard English ships with English crews. Subsequent laws, those passed in 1651, 1660, and 1663, provided the basis of the Navigation Acts. The first Navigation Act, 1651, resembled the legislation of 1645, but was more far-reaching. It stipulated that goods could only enter England, Ireland, or the colonies aboard English, or English colonial, ships. Further, colonial coastal trade was to be conducted entirely aboard English ships. The Second Navigation Act, 1660, reaffirmed that goods could only be transported aboard English ships and established a list of enumerated articles that had to be shipped directly to England. The intent was to prevent the colonies from trading directly with any other European country. England required the colonies to sell their materials to English merchants or pay duties on goods sold to other countries. The list of articles included sugar, cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, molasses, apples, and wool. In 1663, Parliament passed the Staple Act, making it illegal for colonies to buy products directly from foreign countries. European countries would first need to ship their products to England or pay customs fees. Through the Navigation Acts, England tried to establish itself as the gatekeeper of colonial imports and exports. But the laws were difficult to enforce, and the colonists easily circumvented them. Smuggling was rampant. Still, the laws, which continued to be passed until the eve of the American Revolution, 1775–83, had little effect on the colonial economy, which grew at twice the rate of England's during the period.
Why is Spain's Alhambra historically important?
The elaborate palace, built east of the city of Granada, in southern Spain, was built by Moors, Muslim North Africans who occupied the Iberian Peninsula. Spain and Portugal, for hundreds of years during the Middle Ages, 500–1350. The fortified structure, built between 1238 and 1354, is a monument of Islamic architecture in the Western world. Its name is derived from an Arabic word meaning red, the highly ornamental palace. with its decorative columns, walls, and ceilings, was constructed of red brick. Perched on a hilltop, the Alhambra was the last stronghold of the Moors in Spain. In 1492 the palace was captured by forces of Spain's King Ferdinand. 1452–1516, and Queen Isabella, 1451–1504.
What happened to the Hindenburg?
The image of the large airship bursting into flames is familiar to many. Hindenburg, a German vessel and the largest airship ever built, exploded while it was trying to land at Lakehurst, New Jersey, at about 7:25 p.m. on May 6, 1937. Hindenburg had just completed a transatlantic flight and had dropped its mooring lines to the ground crew when the hydrogen gas that kept the airship afloat caught fire. Within 32 seconds, Hindenburg was nothing but smoldering rubble on the ground. 62 of the 97 people on board survived the crash. In addition to the 35 passengers and crew who lost their lives. One member of the American ground crew also perished. Though the cause of the fire has never been conclusively determined. It is believed that an atmospheric electrical spark not sabotage ignited hydrogen gas that was flowing from a leak. The fact that the outer cover of the tail section had been observed to flutter just seconds before the explosion lends credence to the explanation that there had been a gas leak. The crash was thoroughly documented. Though travel by airship had been going on for more than 25 years and some 50,000 passengers had been transported without a single fatality. The Hindenburg's landing in New Jersey was still an event for which many spectators turned out. Airships were a marvel of technology. And the Hindenburg in particular was worth seeing since it was the largest afloat. Even though the airship was more than 12 hours behind schedule. Due to weather over the Atlantic, the arrival was eagerly anticipated. The entire event was caught on film, and that documentary was widely shown in movie newsreels. Newspaper and radio coverage also helped link the Hindenburg and airship travel on the whole with terrifying technological disaster. The highly publicized crash effectively ended airship travel. A sister ship, the Graf Zeppelin, was en route from Rio de Janeiro back home to Germany when news of the Hindenburg disaster came in. Upon arrival, the Graf Zeppelin was grounded until the cause of the Hindenburg's crash was known. No passenger airships took flight again. 2 years later, an airplane carried its first paying passenger across the Atlantic. Today, airships, or blimps, are used by major corporations such as Goodyear during national events. Primarily sporting events. Some airships are also used for reconnaissance and patrol.
Where did Christopher Columbus first land in the New World?
Columbus, 1451 to 1506, set sail from Palos, in southwest Spain. On August 3, 1492, and he sighted land on October 12 that year. Going ashore, he named it San Salvador. Alternately called Wudeling's Island, today it is one of the Bahamas. With his fleet of 3 vessels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, Columbus then continued west and south, sailing along the north coast of Cuba and Haiti, which he named Hispaniola. When the Santa Maria ran aground, Columbus left a colony of about 40 men on the Haitian coast where they built a fort, which, being Christmas time, they named La Navidad. Navidad means Christmas in Spanish. In January 1493 he set sail for home, arriving back in Palos on March 15 with a few Indians, Native Americans, as well as some belts, aprons, bracelets, and gold on board. News of his successful voyage spread rapidly, and Columbus journeyed to Barcelona, Spain, where he was triumphantly received by Ferdinand and Isabella. On his second voyage, which he undertook on September 25, 1493, he sailed with a fleet of 17 ships and some 1,500 men. In November he reached Dominica, Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Upon returning to Haiti, Hispaniola, Columbus found the colony at La Navidad had been destroyed by natives. In December 1493 he made a new settlement at Isabela, present-day Dominican Republic. The eastern end of Hispaniola, which became the first European town in the New World. Before returning to Spain in 1496, Columbus also landed at Jamaica. On his third voyage, which he began in May 1498, Columbus reached Trinidad, just off the coast of South America. On his fourth and last trip he found the island of Martinique before arriving on the North American mainland at Honduras, in Central America. It was also on this voyage, in May 1502, that he sailed down to the Isthmus of Panama, finally believing himself to be near China. But Columbus suffered many difficulties, and in November 1504 he returned to Spain for good. He died 2 years later in poverty and neglect. He had, of course, never found the westward sea passage to the Indies in the Far East. Nevertheless, the Caribbean islands he discovered came to be known collectively as the West Indies, and the native peoples of North and South America came to be known collectively as Indians.
When was Saddam Hussein captured?
The former Iraqi leader, known for his cruelty, was caught on December 14, 2003, 8 months after the fall of Baghdad. Hussein, 1937, was found in Ad-Dor, about 9 miles from his hometown of Tikrit. He was said to be hiding like a rat, in a hole across the Tigris River from one of his palaces. His 6 to 8 foot bunker was equipped with a basic ventilation system and was camouflaged with bricks and dirt. A disheveled Hussein had in his possession about $750,000 as well as arms, which he did not use. The former dictator was taken into custody in what U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld called a surprisingly peaceful manner. Despite that, Hussein reportedly remained defiant and unrepentant when he was asked about the thousands of people killed and dumped into mass graves during his regime. He dismissed his victims as thieves. The news of his capture prompted jubilation in Baghdad and across the nation. Crowds of Iraqis flooded into the streets to celebrate the end of his brutal rule. But his hometown of Tikrit, considered a loyalist stronghold, remained quiet. The news of his capture was welcomed by leaders around the globe. In a short televised address from the White House, President Bush remarked that Hussein would face the justice he denied to millions. Bush also reassured the Iraqi people that they would not have to fear the rule of Saddam Hussein ever again. Hussein was held for questioning in Iraq. Upon the June 28, 2004, transfer of authority, Iraq was given legal custody of the former ruler, who became a criminal defendant instead of a prisoner of war.
Is it true that Edison had no formal education?
It's almost true. Thomas Edison, 1847–1931, had no formal education to speak of. Born in Milan, Ohio, Edison's father moved the family to Port Huron, Michigan. In 1854, their young Edison attended school for the first time in a one-room schoolhouse where he was taught by the Reverend and Mrs. G. B. Engel. But this arrangement lasted just a few months. The boy grew impatient with his schooling behavior his teachers interpreted as a sign of mental inferiority. When Edison overheard Mrs. Engel refer to him as addled, he reported it to his mother, Nancy, who promptly withdrew him from the school. From then on his mother taught him at home, introducing young Edison to natural philosophy, a mixture of physics, chemistry, and other sciences. He showed an inclination toward science, and by the age of 10 he was conducting original experiments in the family's home. Edison furthered his education through voracious reading. He sought, and was granted, permission to sell periodicals, snacks, and tobacco to passengers on the train between Port Huron and Detroit, Michigan, some 60 miles away. During the layover in downtown Detroit, Edison spent his time at the public library, where, according to his own recollection, he read not a few books, but the entire library. Even though he lacked a formal education, Edison possessed a keen mind and a natural curiosity. Further, he had the benefit of the schooling provided by his mother as well as access to a library, of which he took full advantage. Then something happened that changed Edison's life. While still a young man, he lost his hearing. Biographer Matthew Josephson explains that the deafness had two effects on Edison. Not only did he become more solitary and shy, but Edison turned with an even greater intensity toward his studies and began to put forth tremendous efforts at self-education, for he had absolutely to learn everything for himself.
How did the Charleston get started?
The Charleston, a lively ballroom dance, emerged in 1923 as one of the flashy elements of the period in American history that writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, 1896 to 1940, dubbed the Jazz Age. Other hallmarks of the Jazz Age, also called the Roaring Twenties, were speakeasies. Since the country was in the midst of prohibition, flappers, roadsters, raccoon coats, hedonism, and iconoclasm, the optimism of the Jazz Age came to a screeching halt on October 29, 1929. When the U.S. stock market crashed.
What were the fireside chats?
They were radio broadcasts of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's, 1882 to 1945, messages to the American people. FDR began making the informal addresses on March 12, 1933. During the long and dark days of the Great Depression. In his efforts to reassure the nation, FDR urged listeners to have faith in the banks and to support his New Deal measures. Sometimes beginning his talks with my friends, the radio broadcasts were enormously successful and attracted more listeners than even the most popular broadcasts during this golden age of radio. FDR continued his fireside chats into the 1940s, as Americans turned their attention to the war effort.
What are the bodies and agencies of the United Nations?
The UN's charter establishes 6 main bodies and explains their duties and operating methods. The General Assembly is the major forum, all member nations are represented there. And the Assembly can discuss any issue that is deemed relevant and important to the UN. The Security Council has the major responsibility for preserving peace. The Economic and Social Council investigates economic questions and works to improve living standards. The Secretariat is the UN's administrative body. Helping all organs do their work, the Trusteeship Council assists non-self-governing territories. And the International Court of Justice hears disputes between member nations. Except for the last one, all bodies convene in the UN headquarters in New York City. The International Court of Justice meets in The Hague. Since the Charter was written in 1945, the United Nations has established numerous agencies, committees, and commissions to help carry out its work around the world. Among those that are most well known to the public are the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and cultural organization, UNESCO, which encourages the exchange of ideas among nations. The United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, which assists children and adolescents worldwide, particularly those in devastated areas or developing countries. The World Health Organization, WHO, which promotes high health standards around the globe. The International Labour Organization, ILO, which works to improve labor conditions and protect workers. And the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which addresses currency and trade issues.
If the Roman Empire was so powerful, how could it have fallen?
One could argue that the Roman Empire collapsed under its own weight. It had become too vast to be effectively controlled by any one ruler. By the close of the Punic Wars in 146 BC, Greece, Macedonia, and the Mediterranean coasts of Spain and Africa had been brought under Roman control. Within a century, Rome again began to expand overseas. Under the Roman general Pompey, 106 to 48 BC. Eastern Asia Minor, Syria, and Judea, Palestine, were conquered. Next, Gaul was conquered by Pompey's rival, Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC. Adding the territory west of Europe's Rhine River to the Roman world. In 31 BC, in the Battle of Actium, Octavian 63b.ca.d.14, Julius Caesar's adopted son and heir, defeated the forces of Mark Antony, c. 83 to 30 BC. And Cleopatra, 69 to 30 BC, Queen of Egypt, and in 30 BC Egypt became a Roman province. In 27 BC Octavian became the first Roman emperor and was known as Augustus, meaning exalted. Though Octavian's rule marked the beginning of the long period of stability called the Pax Romana. The Roman Empire had become so large, stretching across Europe and parts of Africa and the Middle East, that only a strong, central authority could govern it. During the 200 years of the Pax Romana, Rome's emperors gradually grew more powerful, to the point that after death an emperor was worshipped by the people. But soon there were threats to this central control, not the least of which was the spread of Christianity, as well as invasions from the Germanic Goths and the Persians. Theodosius I, 379 to 395, was the last emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire. When he died in AD 395, the empire was split into the West Roman Empire and the East Roman Empire, setting the stage for the decline of the Romans. The West Roman Empire came under a series of attacks by various Germanic tribes, including the Vandals and the Visigoths, the western division of the Goths, who invaded Spain, Gaul, in Western Europe, and Northern Africa. These assaults eventually led to the disintegration of the West Roman Empire by 476. The East Roman Empire remained more or less intact, but it became known as the Byzantine Empire. and was predominantly a Greek-oriented culture from 476 until 1453, when it fell to the Turks.
What were the 10 plagues?
The 10 plagues were delivered by God to the people of Egypt as a way of convincing the Pharaoh that he was to let the Israelites go so Moses could lead them out of bondage and into the promised land. The plagues were, in the order described in Exodus: 1. Water turned into blood, 2. Frogs, 3. Gnats, 4. Flies, 5. Pestilence, 6. Boils, 7. Hail, 8. Locusts, 9. Darkness, and 10. Death of the firstborn. It was not until the 10th plague had been delivered that the Pharaoh agreed to let the Israelites leave.
What was the Taliban?
It was the ultra-conservative faction that ruled Afghanistan from late 1996 until December 2001. When its government crumbled following a U.S.-led military campaign. The Persian word Taliban means students. The group was made up of Afghan refugees who, during the Soviet invasion, 1979–89, had fled their country for Pakistan, where they attended conservative Islamic religious schools. After the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan and amidst the unrest that ensued, the Taliban rose to prominence. They gained control of the nation region by region, eventually taking the capital of Kabul in 1996. While in power, the group put into force strict laws based on a fundamental interpretation of Islam. The Taliban excluded women from Afghan society, and it allowed the nation to become a training ground for Islamic terror groups such as Al-Qaeda. Very few nations of the world recognized the Taliban government. Its human rights abuses, principally the complete disenfranchisement of women and girls, were decried by the international community. But the breaking point came after the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland. When the American government requested that the suspected mastermind of those attacks be extradited from Afghanistan to the United States, the Taliban refused. The group was forcibly ousted in the brief military campaign that followed. In December 2001, the United Nations, UN, convened a conference in Bonn, Germany, where leaders of anti-Taliban ethnic factions decided on a post-Taliban transitional government, led by Pashtun leader Hamid Karzai. The Pashtuns are the dominant group in Afghanistan, representing about 42% of the population. The next largest group is the Tajik, which represents about 27% of the population in the highly fragmented nation of 28.5 million people. Attendees also agreed to an unled peacekeeping operation. Though ethnic rivalries and sporadic conflicts continued under the transitional government, Afghanistan made strides in building a stable, democratic government. One encouraging sign of reform came in March 2005, with the appointment of Habiba Sorabi, the first woman to become a provincial governor in Afghanistan history. Sorabi was chosen by the president for her post, which she assumed in late March. When did the U.S.
What was the reconstruction?
The Reconstruction was the 12-year period, 1865 to 77, of rebuilding that followed the Civil War. The last battle over, the South lay in ruins, food and other supplies were scarce, people were homeless. City centers had been destroyed, schools were demolished, railways torn up, and government was non-existent. Further, the nation had new citizens to enfranchise and protect the freed slaves. There was also the question of how to readmit each southern state to the Union. In short, the nation's wounds needed to heal. But the long years of the Reconstruction brought only more divisiveness and quarrels. This time the battlefield was not Gettysburg or Chattanooga, but Washington. D.C. President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, a Southern Democrat and former slave owner, squared off with Congress, led by a radical Republican faction. The two branches of government fought over who should guide Reconstruction policy. Johnson favored a more tolerant and swifter approach to reuniting the nation. But his measures failed to protect the country's black citizens. Congress proceeded more cautiously, setting up military administrators in the South as an interim form of government until readmission of the states could be effected. In the end, Congress won out by overriding President Johnson's vetoes again and again. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which took a first step toward enfranchising the black population by guaranteeing the legal rights of former slaves, the Reconstruction Acts, 1867. Outlining how each Southern state would be readmitted to the Union, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which extended the life of the wartime agency in order to help Southern blacks and whites get back on their feet, and adopted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the so-called Civil War Amendments. Since the South was based on agriculture, the economy slowly recovered, eventually becoming more industrial. Public schools were established in each state, and the state governments became more open than they had been, with more offices up for election rather than appointment. In addition, blacks were guaranteed the vote and the right to run for office. But there was resistance to all these measures, and the post-Civil War recovery was not smooth. Many historians believe that the controversy that ensued in the years that followed the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, April 1865, laid the groundwork for segregation and other injustices that brought on the civil rights movement. Many also believe that the problems are still with the country today.
Who said, We have met the enemy and they are ours.
It was Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, 1785–1819, who wrote the famous words in a letter to General William Henry Harrison. 1773–1841, after defeating the British at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813. An improvised U.S. squadron commanded by Captain Perry, 28 years old, achieved the victory in the War of 1812 battle. The message he sent to Harrison, who later went on to become the 9th U.S. President, was: "We have met the enemy and they are ours, 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." Perry received a gold medal and thanks from Congress for the victory.
Which British monarch has ruled the longest?
Victoria, 1819–1901, claims the distinction of having remained on the throne of England the longest. She became queen in June 1837 upon the death of her uncle, King William IV, 1765–1837. Since she was but a teenager at the time, during the early years of her reign she relied on the guidance of the Prime Minister. The tactful Lord Melbourne, William Lamb, 1779–1848, whom she counted as a friend. After marrying Prince Albert, 1819–1861, in 1840, she also sought out advice from him and his advisor. But by 1850 she had grown confident in her abilities, and she managed the country's affairs with authority. Later in her reign, Prime Ministers Benjamin Disraeli, 1804–1881, and William Gladstone, 1809–1898, gradually secured increased authority for that office without alienating the Queen. It is for this reason that she is often seen as the first modern monarch, of which she remains a lasting symbol. Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 amidst an outpouring of public support. She remained on the throne for more years, until her death in 1901. During her 64-year reign, Queen Victoria presided over the rise of industrialization in Great Britain as well as British imperialism abroad. Architecture, art, and literature flourished, in part due to the influence and interests of Prince Albert. It was the prince who in 1851 sponsored the forward-looking Great Exhibition at London's Crystal Palace. It was the first international exposition, a world fair. The Grand Crystal Palace remained a symbol of the Victorian age until it was destroyed by fire in 1936.